Welcome back to Knox's Artillery. On this second episode, we'll be discussing candles and candle making. In the 18th century, there were several forms of artificial man-made light, such as oil lamps, rush lamps, and candles. We'll be focusing on candles for today's presentation. In the 18th century, there were several types of candles. There were tallow candles. They were made from the rendered beef fat or sheep's fat. There were wax candles, such as beeswax and bayberry, and spermaceta, made from a fatty gland in the sperm whale. A description of candle making may be found in this 1747 copy of the London Tradesman. On page 270 and 271, it describes the duties of a chandler, which was one who made candles. It speaks to making mold candles. Mold candles are made thus. They have molds made of lead, tin, or glass of different sizes, according as they intend to make candles. The wick is prepared of cotton, the same as for store candles, and fixed in the middle of the mold. When all the molds are wicked, the tallow already rendered is melted and poured into the molds, and is allowed to stand some time until the tallow is perfectly congealed and cold. Then the candle is drawn out. While the dipping method of making candles, that is, taking a wick and repeatedly dipping it into wax over and over again, was certainly the easiest and cheapest method, we're going to focus on the mold method. It's convenient and handy and allows us to make a small, more controlled batch without having to have a large vat of wax. So, now that you have a little bit more information and background on the history of candle making, let's dive into the process. Alright, we're back in the workshop. We're going to get our trusty hot plate fired up here. And today we'll actually be making bayberry candles that you can see here, not quite beeswax. Bayberry is a really cool wax. It melts to a very pleasing green color and makes for a really nice looking candle. It has the same characteristics as beeswax. So while that starts to melt, we're going to get to work here and prep our candle mold. We're going to be using modern braided wicking. In the 18th century, wicks were twisted out of hemp or flax strands, and as they burned, they would not burn themselves out. A braided wick such as this, as you're accustomed to seeing with candles, kind of curves at the top, and as it does that, it burns and incinerates the end, not requiring much trimming. 18th century candles required constant trimming. So for our purposes, for reenactment events and other living history, the braided, easily attainable modern wicking is our choice for candle making. All right, now that our bayberry wax is melted, we're going to use a wax thermometer. We want to be right around 215 to 225, no higher, for casting in a tin mold. While we wait for the temperature of the wax to come up, we will continue to prep our mold. So Townsend has a great video on candle making. It's a couple years old, but it's the process we use. We didn't get this mold from him. We got this from someone else on eBay. So it does call for a mold release spray. So we just use a cooking spray like he suggests, and that'll let the candles come right out, no problem, after they've sat. So a little squirt in each tube, and the candle should come right out, no problem. Without question, the most tedious part of this process is getting the wicks through. Some folks use a wick puller. I've found that these holes are big enough that you can just feed them through, and it usually is no problem. Just gonna play with it sometime here. And there we go. One side, you want to leave these attached to the middle. We just stick our wick in the mouth and just wet the end, and that's usually enough to get it into the hole here. And we just feed it through gently until it comes out the other end. All right, once that's through the other end here, which it just was a second ago, and it kind of retracted, the walls get a little sticky with the mold release, so we'll feed it enough through until we get it like so. And then we just want to pull it out. Until it looks like that. So we're going to go ahead and repeat that process for the other holes in the mold, and we'll be right back. Okay, now that we have wicked all of our molds, we need something to suspend the wick in the middle of the mold so that when we pour the wax in, it stays right in the center. You don't want the wick to move to one side or the other. I've used small dowels, or I've used the shafts of like small hobby paintbrushes, but I found that these little clips or pins or cotter pins, whatever you want to call them, actually work pretty well. They kind of just pinch the wick, you just wrap it around once or twice and pull it taut, and that holds it pretty effectively, and it's a lot quicker and easier than trying to mess with bigger dowels or other means of suspending the wicks. So once that's complete, we're going to go ahead and make some putty balls to plug up the bottom or the tip of the candle so the wax does not fall out. Alright, what you see here now is just some wax putty that we ordered off of Amazon to plug up the bottom or the tip of the candle, the opposite end from which you pour. You need something to block the wax from just pouring right out. Some folks recommend using wax balls. I found that to be a little bit difficult. Sometimes if it's too small of a ball, the wax will melt off, it'll heat up, it'll fall off, and then you just pour the wax right into the mold and it just pours out right through it. It makes a mess. So we're going to try out these little putties, make them into some balls here in just a second. You'll see how we put them on the mold. Okay, before we go ahead and plug the bottom of the molds up, we need to trim off the excess wicking. You don't want to have too much up there. As you pour the wax into the mold, inevitably some wax is going to miss the hole and congeal around the top, and as it cools, if you have all that extra wicking just laying about, it's going to get stuck in the wax, and it makes it very difficult to get the candles out when the time comes without disturbing the candle. So once it's all trimmed off, we'll clean up the rest of this wicking real quick. We'll get this flipped over, being careful to not knock the pins off on the bottom as we flip it, because they kind of rest upon the raised frame. We're going to take our putty, just roll it up, and just stick it on nice and tight. We want to make sure that we seal these up good and tight. You can see that the holes here are rather large that the wick comes through, and the wax will pour right out. That's why we ended up using these balls of putty as opposed to balls of wax. Many times if I had a ball of wax on there that wasn't big enough, like I mentioned before, the hot wax would jet right into it. It would melt just enough to fall off the mold, and then you'd come back 10 minutes later and your mold was empty. So let's get these sealed up, prepare to pour some wax. Alright, we've got our wax, it's ready to go. The wax is between 210 to 220 degrees, no hotter than 225. I'm going to take this tinfoil baking tray and place the mold inside of it in case one of those putty balls were to fail, or if I spill, it will pour out into that and not make a mess and have a bunch of congealed cold wax all over your workspace. There we go. It's about 2 ounces of wax per mold. Just enough. Now that we have our wax poured in our molds, we will let them sit. We're going to set an initial timer for 10 minutes. We'll come back to them, but they're going to sit for a total of about 4 hours. Alright, the candles are set for about 10 minutes, and you'll notice that they're starting to kind of sink in. And as I understand it, this is because the wick absorbs some of the wax and it kind of creates this cavity. So you don't want to wait too long to fill these in. Otherwise, the wax that's in the mold and the wax that you have to add here to top it off are two different temperatures, and they kind of come out of the mold as like a separate piece. Not the end of the world where it's towards the bottom of the candle, but I try to get these topped off within 10 minutes. You can see I missed a lot of wax on top of the mold. We'll scrape that off and recycle it into other candles. I think some people come back and do this more than once, but I've found that one time is sufficient to get the candle where you want it. Okay, now that they're topped off here, we'll let them sit for about 4 hours until set. Alright, the candles are dry. It's been about 4 hours. Sometimes they go as long as 6, but I find 4 is usually pretty good. My workshop is usually 65 to 70 degrees and very dry, about 50 or so with the humidity. So you can see some separations around the edges. We're going to take this wooden dowel and just push down on the candles to release them from the mold. Once you've pushed on each candle, flip the mold over, cut the wicks, and the candle should pop right out. And the result are these really nice green bayberry candles. It takes about 10 pounds of bayberries to yield 1 pound of usable bayberry wax. So it wasn't a very efficient means of making wax for candles. Continental Army soldiers like the ones we recreate in Knox's artillery would most likely have been issued tallow or beeswax candles, or a candle made from a mix of tallow and beeswax. They were issued 10 candles per 12 privates and NCOs a week, so there really weren't a lot to go around. But these really come out nice. We really like making our own candles in-house for use around Knox's artillery. And once they're all out of the mold, just stack them in a cool, dry place for storage until they're ready to be used. We really hope this video was informative. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.